Today we have Dr. Tiffany Manuel who will be presenting on this topic. She serves as Vice President for Knowledge, Impact, and Strategy at Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise is a national housing and community development intermediary with over 600 employees that manages about $20 billion in assets, invests more than $5 billion in new capital and community development projects annually, advocates for policies and develops programs that expand opportunity for low-income families. At Enterprise, Tiffany leads a team that advances Enterprise's work to expand opportunity for low-income families through strategy, research, predictive analytics, and impact assessment. Tiffany is passionate about translating predictive analytics and impact assessment. Tiffany is passionate about translating the insights harvested from this work to increase opportunities for public deliberation and public will building around systems change. Tiffany holds doctorate and master's degrees in public policy from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, a master's degree in political science from Purdue University, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. She is a highly sought-after speaker and the author of several articles, book chapters, and reports. Tiffany, I'm happy to hand over the presentation to you. And again, it's *7, Tiffany, to unmute.
There you go. Can you hear now?
Yes, great. Perfect.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to come on and speak to your members. I'm excited to join you today. We've at Enterprise, I hope you can hear from our sort of the intro, have a deep and long-term commitment to not just affordable housing, but really to community development. How do we develop places that folks actually want to live and can thrive, whether you are have very minimal circumstance in terms of your financial means or have a lot. You should have a place to live that helps you to access opportunity, to feel excited about your prospects for life and live in a community that allows you to pursue the best that life has to offer you. And so we are deeply involved in the space of affordable housing. We do a lot of that, both in terms of capital and also in terms of kind of on-the-ground solutions in various places across the country, as well as in the policy space. And so what I'm going to share with you a little bit today is some work that we've been doing around messaging and communications. My own background, as you heard a little bit about in the intro there, is mostly in data and sort of case making, thinking about what's the data that we need to make the case for why affordable housing and community development and all kinds of programs that specifically serve low and moderate income families are useful, needed, add value, have significant impacts, have cost savings, all those kinds of proof points that we need for case making. Before I worked at Enterprise, I worked at the Frameworks Institute, who is one of our partners in this work, along with a couple others. We partnered early on with HUD and National Center for Healthy Housing, and even Make Room, which is a campaign to address some of the rental housing issues across the country. So I wanted to share a little bit about why we are so invested in this work, and I'm gonna share with you all the things that I hope you already know first, and then hopefully as we go throughout the webinar, maybe share some new insights that can help you in thinking about messaging. So the things you already know, I hope, is that this is a really important moment, a catalytic moment for all of us. We all know that housing insecurity is growing across the country. It's growing across all racial groups. It's growing across all areas of the country, whether you're rural or urban. It's growing in, whether you're in big cities or not, whether you're in the south or in the north. We know that housing insecurity is growing. And we also know that it's growing across income levels. So even lots of middle-class families or even upper-class families who normally would not pay as much for housing are also beginning to see the cost of housing sort of creep into their discretionary income in terms of their income. So that allows us, it's an interesting moment because that is happening at such an impressive rate. It allows us potentially the opportunity to engage some folks who previously would not have been interested in this issue. They would not have thought twice because the housing issues, they may not have known anybody who was homeless. They may not have known anybody who was low income and struggling to find a decent apartment in a decent neighborhood. They may not have been struggling themselves to kind of address some of these issues. But all of a sudden, across the nation, housing is rising, mostly at the local level at this point, but rising to the top of the heap because so many people are now experiencing housing insecurity. So again, that gives us this opportunity to bring people into the conversation who haven't been in the conversation before. In addition, we know there's a lot of policy and regulatory issues at stake, so we are now looking at a HUD budget probably for 2018 that is going to be significantly reduced. So our ability to get our work done usefully without potentially the benefit of CDBG funds or a lot of our homelessness funds or other set-aside resources are significantly at stake. And so again, our ability to effectively communicate a message that has that underscores the value of what we do probably has never been more important than it is at this particular moment. There's also this interesting thing that we've got lots of research that's coming out and sort of renewing kind of interest in this issue of how housing is related to neighborhood quality and opportunity. So some of you have been watching things like Raj Chetty, who was a sociologist at Harvard and now at I think he's at Stanford now, talking about what happens when you grow up in certain kind of communities. We know we can predict, a child growing up in one kind of community, low poverty neighborhood versus one that's high poverty has significantly better chances, and we know we can quantify what that looks like, not just in terms of the sort of lost earnings and wages, but all kinds of issues that will be affecting those folks later in life. And so having that kind of discourse on the front page of the newspapers consistently has been important. We also have things like Matt Desmond, who has been talking a lot on the circuit from his book, Evicted. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to do so. But again, having somebody of that stature kind of in the news regularly gives us an opportunity to begin having a conversation with people who might not normally be having the conversation or be thinking about housing as an issue, but now they are. And then I would say certainly a renewed conversation we've seen in the housing space around racial equity. We're getting more folks who want to have this sort of race equity conversation now than ever before. I think some of that may be being prompted by just the sort of tone of the country in terms of the last presidential election, which brought up a lot of these kind of race issues. And so a lot of the folks in the housing space want to have that conversation in a very constructive way. And then finally, I think there's a growing expectation just around how we engage residents better as advocates. How do we engage the public around the need and the value of what we do? And so I think taken as a whole, this really, in the midst of a whole lot of stuff that's going on that's not terribly positive for us, there really is this kind of unique moment to communicate better about why what we do as housers is important, how it affects the communities in which we live, and also why everybody has a stake in our success. So let me just talk about what makes that difficult. I think sometimes when we try and communicate what we do as housing and community development experts on the left, often doesn't translate well to the public and policymakers. So you get this kind of thing that looks like this, where there's kind of a gulf in the middle, where we have these great conversations about what housing and community development means and what do you do and how do you develop communities so that people get what they need to thrive. And that doesn't often go well with the larger public conversation, which if you think about it, has largely ignored housing for a variety of reasons. And we just got through with the presidential election at the end of last year, where housing was barely even mentioned, right? Which is astounding when you think about the role that housing plays. Housing almost brought down, right, really the world economy in 2009, right? Right. So housing was at the center of that. Housing is the number one, the largest expense that most low and moderate income families have. So that eats up the majority of their budget. And housing is also, for low and moderate income families, the gateway to wealth, right? It's the home building, it's owning a home, and the equity that families build up in their homes that allows them to have an asset. Without that, they usually don't have, right, the kind of assets that other higher income families. They don't have the second home and the stocks and bonds and all the other things that allow them to create wealth. So with housing being so important, we're having a very rich conversation in our circles about why that's important and necessary. But that is not translating to the public conversation in a way that we would like it to. And often what happens is when we try to communicate effectively, a backfire effect. So some of you may have been watching, we have put out a report. I'll make that report available to you all at the end of this call on sort of the things that we know that are backfiring in the housing space. And we have a whole report on that in lots of detail. And I hope some of you have already had a chance to read. If you haven't, I would encourage you to get it. But really looking at what are the things that are consistently backfiring. When we try to communicate about the value of housing, the things that come back in a very different way. And I thought I would start by giving us just some examples. So this is an article that was in the New York Times. One of the ways you can figure out really quickly what's backfiring is you go to the comment section at the bottom of these articles. So I would say in Pennsylvania, like Google, not even Google, but even go to the local newspaper, put in affordable housing, scroll all the way down to the comment section, and you will see what are the kind of things when this backfires, what are the kind of things that people say. And I will say what's interesting about this, too, is lots of the newspapers like the Times are now trying to limit the comment section because a part of what you get is, lots of folks who are trying to say very calmly whether they agree or disagree, but then you also get folks who are saying things that are really tough, right? And so this article, which was a really a great editorial, just talking about why we need more funding, some of the comments were like this. What about people behaving like responsible adults and living where they can afford to live instead of where they want to? I'd love to live in Manhattan, but I cannot afford it. Does that mean taxpayers have to work harder to buy me an apartment or whatever else I want? Another one, this approach is dubious at best in San Francisco. This article was about across the country, which is known for homeless population. We've been throwing money at that issue for years, and it's been it's been little more than paying the salaries of homeless rights activists. Another one, we can't help the homeless. We spend all this money, and they go on about Obama and et cetera, having a more robust safety net, and that hasn't done very much of anything. Another person who says, in our family, when we can't afford housing in a particular locale, we move to a place where we can afford to live. There are many places in the U.S. where housing is inexpensive and unskilled jobs exist. Provide a one-way bus ticket to those locales for those who cannot afford to live in New York, along with job information and a reasonable temporary stipend. And so you get this consistent pushback around some of the very things that we're talking about. This is another one talking about addiction, where, common response was, make it so landlords can throw people out, right, who don't pay rent, and you'll see rents go down. Another in the Washington Post was just talking about, D.C. and the region itself is not doing enough to get rid of affordable housing. Our crime problems in D.C. are not coming from those in upper middle class households. They're coming from those living in public housing and income capped and subsidized housing. The sooner people living in this quote-unquote affordable housing, which, by the way, is code word for low-income housing, are pushed out of the region, the better. Gentrify D.C., gentrify every last bit, push the criminal and parasitic class out of the city for good. And you see this over and over. If they cannot afford to live in D.C., there's a simple solution. It's called moving. There are far cheaper cities, and no one is entitled to live here if they can't afford to do it on their own dime. And so over and over again across the country, I've never met this in the L.A. paper. I've never met anybody so poor they said they couldn't afford to move. If you're really poor, why can't you put your stuff in a couple suitcases or take a bus? Or rent a U-Haul if you have furniture to move. I've known people so broke they had to borrow bus fare, but they still managed to move. And so consistently you see this theme about moving. So I could go on and on and on. This is the only real solution this country was built on mobility, moving to a place where you can have a better life. Some of us want to live in L.A. because of what we do, but most people can afford far better lives in the 90% of the country that's not L.A., New York, or San Francisco. All of the people listed in that example made poor life choices. Chicago. So I won't go through all of these, but you can see in almost every newspaper across the country, you literally you can open that newspaper, and the responses are traditionally the same. And I want to say two things about that. This is not an aberration. Consistently, this is on NPR, and NPR has a fairly left-leaning, I would say, audience, and you see the same thing. A quick Google search found multiple apartments less than $1,600 in Annapolis. Some even as cheap as $1,000 or $1,200. If you can't afford a certain home, do what I do, live somewhere else. It's like poor people complaining about no affordable housing in Manhattan. Do what people who are neither poor nor rich do. They live in Brooklyn. They live in Queens. And so whether or not you're talking about even fairly left-leaning audiences, you get this consistent conversation about moving, about get a U-Haul, about, right, this was even in one of the most conservative papers, the National Review. We would not expect to see very much support for affordable housing, but what I thought would be important for you to see is at the bottom where they're talking about, this is talking about communities that are mostly poor white communities, and talking about how those communities need to die, which is a whole other issue. But at the bottom you can see the refrain. If you want to give opportunity to those areas, What they need is opportunity, which means they need real change, which means they need U-Haul. So there is a constant conversation about moving as a recourse. And I want to say to this audience is that that's not by mistake. There's no mistake that people across the country, whether in Chicago or D.C. or New York or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or Atlanta, when we say what we need in terms of housing, and we talk about the housing needs, we get consistency in terms of what's coming back at us. So what we have done at Enterprise, we partner with Frameworks, my old partners at Frameworks, to begin to look at both what is backfiring and then to provide sort of resources for understanding how we get up and over that backfire. So the report is called You Don't Have to Live Here. It's the first of 3 reports that we're putting out. This first one is really to identify what are the central things that traditionally backfire when we try to get people to understand or we try to articulate what the housing needs are on the ground. And then we also say in this, why these messages are backfiring and what are the 10 things we can do about it. The second and third paper, another paper is coming out specifically on community development, and another paper coming out specifically on this notion of opportunity through housing across the housing perspective. But for this conversation today, what I thought I would just do is to just lift up a couple of these examples of what's backfiring and why, so that we better understand that, so that as we're trying to shape our messages and have them land on more receptive ears, we can do a better job of thinking through how not to do what I call sort of activate the landmines or step on the landmines or trigger the things that we know are going to cause this immediate kind of reaction. So when you looked at those comments that I just read, one of the things that you should have saw, the tripwires, is that first one at the top of that, I don't know what to call it, hexagon, whatever we've spoken, this graphic, but the mobility, personal responsibility, and self-makingness backfire. That is probably the most pernicious of all of them. It's the one that is that immediate knee-jerk reaction. When you say that we have housing needs, we have this many folks who are homeless, we have other folks who are low income and can't find decent affordable housing, you have other folks who may be even middle class and not being able to find a housing kind of within their budgets, the backfire that comes immediately is about moving. It is about, and it's wedded to this idea of personal responsibility. So when people think about housing, they think about housing. We learned this in the research, and I can talk about what the research entails so you all know, but on this short call, I thought I would just kind of dig right into it. When people think about housing, they mostly think housing is a consumer good. In other words, they equate housing with the same kind of retail choices you would make when you go to the grocery store and buy a box of cereal, or you go to a car dealership and you decide that you want a car. And they don't think they have any responsibility, right, for making sure you have a car, a box of cereal, and or a decent home. The attitude is that, what we're responsible for is making sure you have access to education, make sure that people have access to decent, basic kinds of jobs they can work meaningfully. And after that, everything you are responsible for. So when you talk about what the needs are in terms of housing, the immediate backfire is take personal responsibility. It's your responsibility to figure out what you want to buy with within your budget. And for lots of folks, they cannot afford to live in a city like D.C. or L.A. or Atlanta. Those are or maybe Pittsburgh or maybe even Philadelphia. They should be moving in other parts of the country. They should be living in Kansas. They should be living in South Carolina. There are great affordable houses in Alaska. And if your budget is small enough that you can't afford to live in some of these other cities, then you need to take personal responsibility to look at your budget and figure out what you can afford. In the same way that you would take personal responsibility to buy the car that you could afford. If you couldn't afford a Maserati, which would be a D.C., an Atlanta, a Chicago, a San Francisco, right, you might be able to only afford a Ford Fiesta, and that's South Carolina. That's right. That's the middle of Kansas. That is in Alaska. But it's not my responsibility to help you to subsidize the cost of you living in a high cost housing market. And so you saw those comments consistently, whether you across the country, move. Take personal responsibility and move yourself and your family with a U-Haul, and that comes up consistently, to a place that you can afford. So that kind of backfire comes up a lot. I won't go through all of these. I know we got a short call today, and I want to leave enough time that we can ask questions and talk this through a little bit. But you can see some of the other ones here. The separate fates, one on the left, is a huge one. When you talk about who's homeless and what the homeless need. When you talk about who has affordable housing issues, people may even be empathetic about that. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, all these folks don't have housing. But what does it have to do with me? I'm struggling myself. It's not my responsibility to solve anybody else's problems. I got my own problems. I may be middle class, but I still have issues that I'm trying to struggle with in my own life. And so if, Johnny or Jones or Mary are having problems with housing, I'm really sorry about that. But what does that have to do with me? And so that kind of separate faith is challenging. And I will say that until you can help your audience understand that the fate of their children is related to the fate, right, of folks to the children of folks who are struggling with housing, until they see those things as linked, you will not be able to get them to understand why they have a stake in their success. And that is critical. So this separate faith backfire is challenging. The only other one I think I'll do is the bottom, which is crisis. We talk a lot in terms of the housing crisis. I see a lot of that coming up now because we as housers think we are in a crisis. I would say we are. But you have to understand that kind of crisis language actually has the opposite effect. It does not engage people. It actually makes people disengage. Because every time they turn on the news, there are 1,000 different crises they've got to manage, right? There's a crisis with the Russians, and the crisis with the next crisis is our Affordable Care Act is going down, and people are going to be kicked off health care. And the next crisis, we have trains or whatever. There are 1,000 of them. And so when we add our crisis to the back of a bunch of others, it doesn't have the same effect. What people want to do is they want to shut down rather than engage our issues. And so having different kinds of language that indicates urgency but not crisis is always better in messaging. So I'm going to stop there in terms of the backfire. You can download the report from our website at enterprisecommunity.org or .com, and you can just type in "you don't have to live here" and you will get the report. What I thought I wanted to do was just make two additional points. One is just to say that when we say there's a backfire, we're not saying that backfire effect is just kind of general language. We're saying that backfire effect because there really is a sort of social scientific sort of that means more than just a kind of colloquial term. The social scientists have been studying this sort of backfire effect for many years. When you say something and it evokes a kind of reaction on the other side of it that is inconsistent with what people believe, what actually happens is when you try and kind of argue somebody out of those positions, what we know from lots of years of social science is that you actually make it worse. So if you try to argue somebody out of that stuff, well, it's not about personal responsibility, it's really about public policy and systems, and here's my data and evidence, right? When you try to directly argue folks out of this stuff, it actually has the opposite effect. What happens is their confidence in the prior position actually increases regardless of the evidence they're faced with. So the only thing I want to say about that is when you look at those areas of backfires, and I hope you'll pick up the report, what we strongly suggest, given about 15 to 20 good years of social science research, that you don't try to directly argue folks out of that. What you'll do is you'll make it worse. The way to address this is to really reframe the issue by the way that you're constructing messages that get around some of those triggers that people have. And I will say, just so that people, we're not going to convince everybody, right? You're not going to convince everybody that housing assistance programs and that the things that we need to do our work, you're not going to convince all of them that those are the right course of action. But there actually are a lot of folks who really just don't understand what housing means and kind of, if we were to reframe the conversation, could actually be won over. And so that's really our target. It's not the folks who are hardcore, kind of, hardcore, don't see any usefulness of government, don't see any reason to have a social safety net for folks who don't have resources. But there are a lot of folks in what political science calls the bystander middle, where folks really, really, with some thoughtful conversation, could be won over and could actually be helped in terms of their support for the kinds of policies that we would like to see reflected. So in the report, because we do not want to get you all depressed, we did not want to leave you with just all these things that are backfiring and say, all these things that are going wrong, we offer 10 sort of redirections in the report for things that you can do right now today to get folks up and over some of those backfire things. So I'm going to just go indiscriminately across a couple of these and then maybe give some specific examples. One of the things I like to say is, number one, start with why. One of the things we don't do enough of is having folks understand why they have a stake in our success. So when you go and you tell a story about a homeless person and you tell it in a lot of detail and it's maybe very sad, the person might even feel, but the receiver of that story may even feel sympathetic or empathetic about that person's life. But if they don't see why they have a stake in that person's life or how their fate is connected to that person, it's really hard to help them to shift their perspective and get them to support policies and programs that we care about. So starting with why. Why do you have a stake in this issue? And I'm happy to give some examples in just a second. Another one is, I would take number 7, future orientation. A lot of our messaging is awfully negative. It's because we're dealing with really tough issues. It's sad, it's negative, it's dark. We know that our brains are actually wired for optimism. Isn't that funny? Our brains are actually wired, right, to be optimistic. Otherwise, how would we get up in the morning in the face of all the craziness that's going on in the world today? But most of us, our brains are wired for optimism. And so when you have a story that's talking about all these folks who can't afford housing and they have all these bad choices and it's really sad, people actually walk away. They disengage from those kinds of messages because they don't feel the optimism in those stories. Now, I know, I hope I'm going to counter what you may say. Yeah, but we're telling really sad stories about situations that are really serious. That may be true, but there is a way to bring optimism into those stories, and the more you do to engage people with a very future orientation that is more optimistic, the more you get them to come around. So, for example, instead of saying we have an affordable housing crisis in this community and we're challenged by that, and this is really sad, right, you may start off by saying, we are you're in the middle of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is a can-do city. We have done so much over the last couple of years to make sure that our city and our region is moving forward. We can do just about anything. And now we've decided to take on this issue of housing because so many people in our region actually need better housing choices. We know that we can do it. We've seen these kind of solutions work in other places, and now what we're asking you to do is to join us in really moving forward with the thinking and planning around how we do that. And then, so here are the kind of things we're moving forward. That's a very kind of uplifting, optimistic message that says we can do it. I think it's probably one of the reasons why Obama sort of won for both times. Regardless of your political persuasion, I will say one of the things that people said consistently about Obama is his ability to give that kind of can-do message, man. Even if you didn't believe him or you didn't want to vote for him, this guy gets up and you just feel like the world is possible, like there's something possible on the other side of that. And when that's true, people want to engage with you, right? They want to have that conversation because they feel like there's some excitement around it. And so our ability to message in a way that conjures up that kind of can-do excitement, that kind of, I call it American pragmatism. We can do it. We just got to get practical, right? That kind of spirit and tone in the messaging actually works better than the way we've been messaging before. So we get lots of additional comments. I would say number 9 is probably the toughest. We say avoid the term housing, and I would say avoid the term affordable housing. In the second paper that we're going to put out, we give even more detail about why that's the case. That housing terminology just tanks every day of the week. It just, and I know it's hard to say that. For housing, we give talk about homes. Nobody lives in housing. They don't know what that means. When you say housing, they think of public housing, and when they do, it conjures up all this negative, even racialized stuff. So we give very specific instructions. Don't talk about housing. Talk about homes. Even affordable housing as an issue is just really, when you put affordable and housing together, that's even a more toxic combination. And so we try to give some examples of things that you can say that get around some of those initial just really negative reactions. So what I thought I would do is just give some more. So you can read the report. We give a lot of very good sort of these 10 steps. I thought I might give a couple just examples of language that we tend to use in the field, and then some redirections. And I got 4, but I may give just 2 in the interest of time because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So first you might ask, what's in our existing frame? What are we already talking about that may be backfiring? So this is something that we tend to say a lot in our industry, and I'd say even in enterprise, we still talk in this language. We're right now redoing our communications to reflect this understanding. But when you say things like more than 11 renter households are severely cost burdened, which means they're paying 50% or more of their incomes for housing, that's a true statement. And we often say that because we want to have people understand this is not just a couple people here and there. There's 11 million people who are already vulnerable because they're low income, who are or renter households that are paying too much for housing. When they're paying that much for housing, you cannot afford very much other things, and so they're having to make trade-offs, dangerous trade-offs, for things like medical equipment, things for their kids, etc. But what I want to say to you is that when you talk in that language, that is a trap. You are going to get trapped in that language because what it evokes immediately is that personal responsibility and mobility issue. Then what? Because when you see that, the backfire will be, yeah, you know what? That's exactly right. Poor people don't know how to manage their money. That's why they're poor. Poor people make bad choices. That's exactly right. If they would manage their money better and move to areas of the country there where they could actually afford, they wouldn't be in those circumstances. But what you won't do is have these folks living in high-cost housing cities and then ask me to subsidize the cost of them living outside of their budgets. And so you just basically triggered something. You've talked about their budgets and what they're paying, which gives folks the opportunity to then judge, to be quite frankly very judgmental about the decisions that individual people are making that might be contributing or not to their circumstance. So you have just triggered something that's bigger. So you might be saying, well, how do you get out of that, right? How do you then talk about the issue without sort of starting in that place? So there are lots of ways to do it. I'm giving just an example, and for some of you on the call, if you're communications folks, you can take this little bit of something and actually give it more life with the individual stories and things like that. But one of the things you can say is something like this: you know, our paychecks are not getting bigger, but the rents are, and it's pushing many of our neighbors out of our community. Many of the neighbors are leaving, have been longtime residents of this community who have watched their kids grow up here, who've gone to church here, who play with their children in the parks, and now after making those contributions to our community, they're now being edged out. We can do better. So let me talk about why that actually works, right? It works because it redirects attention away from the problem of individual agency and redefines the problem as structural. What does that mean? It means that it's hard to sort of blame individual people for that, right? When you're setting up a problem that is about rents are too big and our paychecks are not getting bigger. I don't decide how much the paychecks are of other people. I don't decide, right? So when you define it in that larger way, it means it makes it harder for me to begin to talk about individual people as making choices that are bad and why they should be making choices to move, right? So again, so it won't deter everybody, but for a lot of the folks who are listening to that message, it makes it hard for them to get back to the normal place they would go, which is that personal responsibility and mobility. Let me give another example. In the homelessness space, this is a beginning of a true story. And all of these are things I've taken out of existing messages. Greg and Letitia, this is a story about a couple in Detroit, met, fell in love, lived together, support each other, and they are homeless on the streets of Detroit. And so what a lot of us do is we tell these individualized stories of families like Greg and Letitia, or people who are on the street, they're homeless, and we tell it in a lot of detail because we want people to feel empathetic with us about that issue. The problem is it's a trap. When you do that, you're going to engender the separate fates backfire immediately. I don't know Greg and Letitia. I don't know what choices they made. I mean, they might have been. Were they on drugs? I mean, right? These are all the things that come up for folks, and I don't have anything to do with them. I live in a completely different community way across town, and it's not my responsibility to solve for Greg and Letitia's issues. I'm sorry for them, and I really hope that things get better for them. But I'm going back to my life in the community where I live, where I'm actually struggling to make sure my kids are taken care of, right? So, right, you can't get everybody up and over that, but you can redirect the conversation, and you can do it with something like this. The prosperity of the region depends deeply on the smart investments we make to ensure that the people who work here have a place to call home here. Every dollar that we spend to help a homeless person find a home returns back to us 100 times over in cost savings. And best of all, these homes actually create jobs for everybody. And then you want to start telling the stories of other people in the community, including Greg and Letitia's, that are positively impacted when we address homelessness. So tell the story of the Starbucks manager who says, listen, man, you know, it's really tough if we don't solve this affordable housing, because I can't get consistent workers to Starbucks at 6 o'clock in the morning because people can't afford to live in the community. Or child care workers. They can say, listen, the child care workers are turning over consistently, and they're not able to take care of the kids effectively when they're traveling 2 and 3 hours to and from because they can't afford to live in the communities in which they work. So you can begin to tell the story of a larger number of people in that community who are affected by the lack of affordable homes and the lack of services for folks who are homeless. So why it works is because you are telling the story of us, not the story of them. We don't want to tell the story of them. It's about all of us and how we are all implicated in the decision to provide resources for folks like Greg and Letitia or not. It tells why they have a stake in our success. It's not just that we are trying to help Greg and Letitia, but when we help Greg and Letitia, it helps everybody. It helps the prosperity of our region, helps us make smarter investments. We get those dollars back in terms of cost savings. We might even create some jobs for other folks in our community and for them. So now they have something to hang their hats on in terms of why they see a stake in our success. It moves us away from this value of charity, right, and from the motivation of investment. This is an investment in us. This is not a charitable. If you like charity, great, but this is not just the value of charity. It's a motivation for action beyond that. And it also takes advantage of this connection to jobs. When you ask people what is the most average everyday folks, what is the primary issue they see in their own lives, it's the issue of their financial future and jobs. And so connect this issue of what we're talking about to the issue that you know is on people's minds. Connect it. Like this is a job creator, not just for Greg and Letitia, but for others. I have additional ones, but I think maybe, let me see, I was thinking in the interest of time I would speed up a little bit. Let me do the last one. do the last one. So America has an affordable housing crisis. You might not know it from our national dialogue. We don't like to talk about poverty and homelessness and opportunity, and I will say it's a trap. When you begin, for all the reasons I talked about before, when you evoke that crisis kind of mentality, people hunker down. When you create, there's a book called Scarcity, which is great, which talks about what happens when people feel like there's scarcity. We're in a crisis. This is a negative mode, right? People hunker down in it. They're not likely to open their hearts to be more generous or open their wallets. They hunker down and they feel like they have to kind of sort of prepare for the winter, if you will. And so a different kind of language, that American pragmatism I was talking about, actually gets you farther than that crisis language. So I just said Baltimore, but I could have said Pennsylvania, could have said, Philadelphia, could have said Chicago, doesn't matter. But we're Can-Do City. We are building a reality for our people, a new future for our children, a new model of healthy communities, and providing a great place to live for everybody. That starts with providing quality homes and thriving communities, no matter the size of your wallet. And again, this takes advantage of this value of American pragmatism, which we love. We love that sort of can-do. We can do it. We're Americans. We're Baltimoreans. We're Philadelphians. We're Pittsburghians. I don't know however you say that. But it also focuses on this issue of collective efficacy. We can do it. The agency is at the level of community and not at the level of individual. I hope you all caught that. The place where we're placing responsibility is not on Greg and Letitia to solve their own problems. It's on us as a can-do city, right, a collective, to solve this. It's also got that future orientation. It's optimistic. We can do it. It's in the future. Right? And it also highlights universal benefits. We all benefit when we help Greg and Letitia or whoever it is, right? And so that kind of message gets you up and over some of that crisis and that nagging kind of fatalism that people have, that this is a problem that is too big for us to solve, right? So I had one more, but I think I will stop there and just go to the final slide because I want to make sure we got plenty of time for discussion and all of your questions. The full reports you can get on our website, and you see the report there. You can also catch me on Twitter. And I'll say there are two other reports that are about to come out, one that's focused specifically on messaging around community development, and then another that's specifically focused on this issue of opportunity and how housing fits into that. And I think the one that is probably most shocking is on opportunity. When you frame these issues of housing in terms of opportunity, and we're creating opportunity for people, it backfires very quickly. And so we talk in that paper about why it's backfiring and then give very concrete examples for how you can begin to shift that conversation through reframing. So let me stop there, and we can open it up for questions, comments, thoughts, reflections, all of that.
Great. Thank you so much, Tiffany. I love this conversation. I think it's really relevant, especially for all the reasons that you've described in the webinar. And it's always good to have a reminder about what messaging works. So I'm going to actually unmute the lines to see if that works. Sometimes we get some feedback, so if that happens, then I'll mute the lines and people can unmute themselves, but we're going to try unmuting and people can ask questions. So,
the conference has been unmuted.
so does anyone have any questions for Tiffany? You can just go ahead. Everyone's unmuted, so you can just go ahead and ask them or type them in the chat box on the left if you have questions. Questions, but also maybe examples of additional messaging that works or doesn't work.
Boy, this is a quiet group. They got no messaging challenges in Pennsylvania. I can see. You guys got it all covered. You guys got it all figured out.
I think we're quiet because we're thinking about all you've said.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yes.
Great. My name is Manuel. I'm from Habitat for Humanity, Philadelphia. And one thing I've been wondering a lot about is how to message depending on your audience. So, for instance, we write a lot to corporations and foundations, but we also have a lot of public communications on email blasts or online. And obviously, foundations and other organizations like that already know a lot more about affordable housing issues and other critical problems, and so they might be willing to listen in a lot of different ways. They might not be so averse to the whole crisis sort of talk or statistics. But at the end of the day, there's still people reading these applications. So obviously for email blasts, you want to keep to the positive kind of message, but how do you think that would differ for other kinds of publications?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's
Sorry, Tiffany, you're getting broken up, so I'm actually going to mute the line and see if that helps.
The conference has been muted.
So *7, Tiffany, to unmute yourself. Tiffany, we can't hear you, so if you want to just do *7.
There we go. I was talking away there. So I would say that's a great question and a very astute one. So I would say, as you're.
I'm sorry, Tiffany. Could you actually repeat the question because it was a little hard to hear as well?
Sure. So the question was a great one. The question was about audience, and it was about talking to different kinds of audiences, and being nuanced in the approach to the kinds of audience you're talking to. And the question was, if you're talking, so this might be a great message in terms of the kind of overall sort of public audiences, but what if you're messaging to corporations and foundations and other institutional partners who may, one, have a little bit more knowledge and information about affordable housing as an issue, but also they may have some different needs as part of that conversation. And I think that's exactly right. So I think when we think about sort of public will building, I think there are sort of two pieces of that. One part is the part that is around engaging broader public audiences or that true sort of public will building. The other piece that you're talking about is really case making. These are the folks who making the case for the very specific policy recommendations, programs, and services that we need. And that case-making conversation requires some of this framing, because some of the kind of assumptions that you see baked into these kind of broader public messages, the policymakers and corporate leaders carry some of those same kind of assumptions as well. But the case-making part of the conversation actually requires a little bit more, has some different issues. For example, the way that we use data and information and evidence In the public audience, you can just give a nod to the kind of solutions you've seen happening in other places or solutions that may be working, and that might be enough. When you're talking to corporations and foundations or other institutional players, the level of data or evidence that you have to bring to that conversation is higher, quite frankly. And so what I would say is this conversation is kind of a general conversation for broader public will building. What you're talking about is case making, which does have some additional things and additional framing involved in that. But some of the things, as you rightly said in your question, still hold. The things like having a future kind of more optimistic orientation about what we can do together, telling the story of us. And I would say if you're telling the story of us to corporations and foundations, include them, right? So how are these corporations not benefiting or benefiting when we actually enact better affordable housing policies or we address issues of homelessness better? How are these foundations actually better off when we are addressing those better in terms of our public resources or decisions? So include them in the story of us that you're telling so that they see themselves reflected. I will say that one of the real powers of effective storytelling is that people are able to see themselves inside the story. That really is the power of story. If people can't see themselves somehow reflected in it, then they don't connect to it. And so, having some examples, having corporate leaders who believe in what you all are doing, not only help you shape those messages, but be a part of the story is exactly the way to sort of shape it so that you get more of that sort of strong case-making aspect to it as well. But some of the other things, like start with why. You want to do that whether you're talking to a sort of corporate or audience or not, or whether you're case-making or building public will, you always have to start there. For those folks who haven't had a chance to read Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, I would encourage you to do so because he talks about the way that our brains function and the way that when we enter a conversation, that literally is the question that we are trying to both figure out. What does this have to do with me? Do I have a stake in this? Right, where do I fit into this conversation? And you got about 10 seconds when you have a conversation with somebody about this issue. And when I say 10 seconds, to have them understand their stake in it, which is why you want to start there. If you do not start the conversation with why you have a stake in this, why this is important for you, you've just lost about half of your audience who will not hang around to figure out the rest of that presentation or listen to the rest of what you have to say. Anyway, I could go on and on, but I think that question was fantastic. It's case making and will building. Case making has some additional things that you got to build into it. One of which is the way you build in evidence and data to reflect that. But certainly an important consideration when we think about messaging.
Thanks, Tiffany. That was a great question. I have another question. What do you recommend as the best way to present the issues to our elected officials? I think this is a great question.
Yeah, and it depends on the form that you're going to. So if you're giving a verbal testimony, a written testimony, et cetera, for elected officials, particularly if you go into hearings and things like that, I think probably most of you are really astute in terms of that work. I think there are three things in that kind of messaging. You want to tell, there are three kinds of stories. The story of the story of me, or the story of your individual story. Why are you personally interested in that story? So positioning yourself as part of the conversation. Then you want to tell as part of that the story of us, and then the story of now. And those are three things that kind of you can do even in a short kind of 2 paragraphs. And you all know this, as strong advocates, I'm sure you know this. My name is Tiffany Manuel, and I live in this particular neighborhood. And the reason I'm here is I'm a mother, and I'm concerned that a lot of the kids in my child's school are homeless, and they don't have what they need to really be prepared for class. That means the teachers in that class are spending a lot of time doing remedial work with the students who are challenged, and they're not being able to give their best effort, right, to teach those children. And so from my vantage point, I have a stake in this issue of affordable housing, and that's why I'm coming to you today. In addition, I know that it's not just that I have, that we all have a stake in making sure that our kids have a shot at success, right? Your kids are in the same classroom as mine, so you can tell that story of us, and you can begin to talk about how corporations do that. And then the story of now. This is urgent. We have to do this now. We can do it. We've solved many problems before. We're a can-do city. We got it. But we have to act now, because if we don't, and you can begin to tell the 1, 2, 3 story about why we can't. So I think that's more a traditional sort of playbook in terms of how we traditionally advocate during those hearings, but being able to position yourself as part of the conversation, say a little bit about the story of us, how we're all implicated, and then the story of urgency, which is the story of now. Your ability to sort of put those three things into a very tight, 2 paragraphs or elevator speech or however long they'll give you is probably the best way to begin to talk to your elected.
Thanks, Tiffany. Tiffany, I know you had mentioned that Enterprise was working on a database. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the things that Enterprise is about to release in just a couple weeks here is what we're calling Opportunity 360. It is going to be probably the most comprehensive data related for the community development and housing field that is available today. Data that goes all the way down to the census tract level or the neighborhood level, but gives you comparable data, not just what's happening in that neighborhood, but that neighborhood compared to the region, that neighborhood compared to every other neighborhood in the state, and then that neighborhood compared to every other neighborhood in the country. And so it is just the breadth of that, being able to put in any address in the country and have it spit out to you a 20-page report on what opportunity looks like in that community. It's something we worked very hard on because we were looking at the data and information as well and saying the data that we're all using to make the case, not just for affordable housing, but for community development is really not great. We were saying we can do better, right? Literally, we can do better on the data front. And so we are providing that as a resource, free of charge on our website, and I'm happy to let everybody on the call sort of know to make sure we get an email blast out to everybody when that is available. It also has a resident engagement open access platform for residents to share their feedback about what opportunity looks like in their community or not, which is really important from our vantage point. Oftentimes you will have the data say one thing about what kind of opportunities exist in a neighborhood, and then when you talk to people in those communities, they will tell you a very different story. So a good example is you will have some folks who will say, the data may say that in this community you've got lots of parks and open space and green space and it's great and people have access to places to exercise and those kind of things. But when you talk to residents of that community, they may very well say to you, yeah, but let me tell you, my kids don't have any place to play in this community because those parks are overwhelmed with drug dealers or they're not safe. So I don't feel like I have any place to play. So my kids to play. So the data may say one thing, but residents may often tell you what kind of what they experience being in those communities. And we think both kinds of information is valid, and we need to have a more comprehensive way to look at those side by side and evaluate those. So it has an open source platform for residents to actually respond to that or to talk about what opportunity is in their neighborhoods. And it also has a feature in that identifies partners in the region. So we think a really important piece of the work moving forward is that we housers need to do a better job of having cross-sector partnerships with everybody else in our communities, as well as all of our partners need to do a better job of connecting to us as housers. So, when you want to solve problems in communities, the housers need to be at the table, the health folks need to be at the table, the transportation folks need to be at the table, all those folks need to be at the table. And sometimes what stops us is that we all have our own funding streams, we have different ways of measuring data, et cetera. And so what we try to do is to provide a data-based way or data-informed way of bringing those partners to the table in a way that reflects the primary data from those sectors all in one place, all in a particular way that they can access it together to use that as a start of conversations about what the needs are. Anyway, I could go on for a long, long, long time about that. I won't, but I will say that it is the most comprehensive data source that we have seen at the community-based level. Allows you to look at issues of racial equity and urban versus rural kinds of issues and divide those out. And really just a comprehensive source of data for folks in the community development and housing spaces to use more thoughtfully and effectively.
Thanks, Tiffany. I know I'm really looking forward to that. I think that will be really useful in terms of developing fact sheets and informing legislators about opportunities in their community. Does anyone have any additional questions before we wrap up today? Again, it's *7 to unmute yourself, or you can type a question in the chat box on the left. Okay, well,
everybody's getting ready for the holiday weekend, huh?
Well, that's it for the webinar today. And Tiffany, thanks so much for getting on. This is great information available for today's presentation. So everyone have a wonderful weekend, and we will send out the PowerPoint and audio next week. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.